Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and my program, Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm your host, DP Lyle. And today I have two special guests that are one's an old and dear friend, the other is a new friend. But this is a story that has, for me personally, has been 51 years in the making. As a little bit of history, in June of 1973, I moved to Houston, Texas to begin my residency in internal medicine. And I literally moved into my apartment, started my residency July 1, and 5 weeks later, this story broke. And it broke with Elmer Wayne Henley shooting and killing Dean Corll. Okay. Murders in Houston happened all the time. In fact, it was the murder capital for a number of years back in the late 80s and early 90s. Um, so that wasn't unusual. But what made this unusual initially is that this was two homosexual lovers. That's how it was packaged. So we're flashback 51 years ago. That was not the mainstream. The closet was closed pretty tightly back then. So that became a salacious story. Well, over the next 3 days, all hell broke loose because this story was not just one guy shooting another guy. It became an amazing convoluted story. So now flash forward 51 years and we come to this. And this is the definitive book, I think, on this story that I won't say it's near and dear to my heart, but at least I have a history with. And so it's with great pleasure that I welcome my dear friend, Dr. Katherine Ramsland, who is a professor emeritus at DeSales University up until recently. And that's where she taught forensic psychology. She is a forensic psychologist and behavioral criminology. And she's appeared in more than 250 crime shows. It seems like you can't come on TV without seeing Katherine there um, uh, offering her expertise. She's written close to now 2,000 articles. Last count, 73 books. She'll correct me if that's wrong. And lo and behold, in her spare time, she is now writing fiction that stars well, what would you expect? A female forensic psychologist named Annie Hunter. My other guess is her partner in crime in this book, Tracy Ullman. And Tracy is a documentary producer, director, and writer out of Chicago and has done programs for Discovery and A&E and PBS and Oxygen. And her most recent was a six-part series for Peacock that dealt with the infamous John Wayne Gacy. So I want to welcome both of you to the show.
Very happy to be here and very nice to talk with you again. We haven't talked in a while.
Uh, Catherine and I have been friends for a long time, and we've done classes together and seminars together, many things over the years. Even tried to get a book published together that didn't quite work out. But who knows? It's a new year. Maybe things will happen. Um, so I want to ask each of you. I'll start with you, Catherine. What drew you to this story?
It's something I've been thinking of doing for a while. I'd seen an interview with a brief interview with Wayne Henley on this weird documentary called The Collectors, which is about this mortician and his buddy collecting serial killer art. And Henley was an artist. And I had written some articles about the whole case with one idea about him, but when I saw the interview, I just thought he seemed so different from what I expected. And I kind of put in the back of my mind, this must have been like 2001 or two. I kind of put in the back of my mind to one day contact him. It really came because I had spent 5 years working with the BTK serial killer, Dennis Rader. We got that into production for A&E for a 4-part gig, and then they wanted me to do another one. I remembered Wayne Henley, and Tracy had already made his acquaintance and offered to introduce me. So I wanted to put that to her because that came out of her research that really broadened this story into a much bigger thing.
Tell us about that, Tracy. How did you interface with and I agree, Henley was kind of a milk toast guy. It's kind of like you think this guy couldn't do this, but how did you first get into it?
It means anybody could do it. So
Exactly.
basically, what had happened as a result of the John Wayne Gacy case, I was able to show that Gacy had accomplices And his case started looking more and more like Dean Corll's. And we were trying to find out, we could discern that Gacy had definitely been part of a child sex trafficking ring. He was not a lone wolf. He was not an outlier. He was actually well connected. And so as I was trying to figure out more of that dynamic, I thought the one person who was still living was Elmer Wayne Henley. And so I had been talking with his mother over the years, every now and again, trying to see if there was something I could do as a producer. But then I finally got in touch with him through another friend, and we began corresponding. And what I realized in talking with him was that he had no idea he was part of a larger sex trafficking ring. He saw himself as simply being victimized by this, predator. And the greatest thing was that Katherine and I were working on the BTK series together. I was a consulting producer, and I heard through the grapevine that she was interested in Elmer Wayne Henley. And so that's how we ultimately got connected.
Why don't you give us a thumbnail of this case? I realize it's very convoluted, but there are some broad threads through it. Give us a thumbnail of this case and what it's really all about. We kind of teased it a little that it wasn't just a domestic murder. There was so much more involved.
Yeah, well, with Henley, I was really interested in the accomplice angle because not much has ever been done with that. All accomplices are kind of thrown into the same basket as if they're all alike, and they're not that interesting and not like the predator. But in fact, they are interesting, and there are differences in the types of accomplices. So that was my entree into it, to make it different than just another serial killer book. This is going to be, how did this teenager get leveraged into this position and stay with it for a year and a half. And so in 1973, this case emerges after Henley, who kills Corll. He's the only accomplice to have killed the adult predator to end it. So that's something that sets it apart. But he killed Corll and then turned himself in, told the police. He knew about some bodies being buried in a boat shed. He didn't have to say that, by the way. He could have just, he had saved 2 friends. He could have been a hero. Nobody would have ever known about the bodies, but he did say it because he was horrified by his participation, and he wanted the families to know where their sons were. So he takes them to the boathouse. They start digging. They do find some bodies. He more than he actually thought were there. There were 17 buried in this little boathouse. He then said there are also some on a beach. There are also some in the woods at a lake property, and I will take you there and show you where they are. So by the time it was said and done, over the course of 3 days, it was 27 bodies. Another one was found later, but one of the ones on the list probably wasn't a Corll victim. They just sort of shoved him in, because they were digging up bodies, and there was this other one on a beach. It was 3 miles away, but they still thought it must be a Corll victim, because who's doing this anyway? So back to the story, we also then find out that there's another accomplice, David Brooks, who also turns himself in to say basically he had nothing to do with this. He saw nothing, knew nothing. This is all Wayne Henley. And Henley's thinking David Brooks is unburdening his conscience the way Henley's doing. So he then goes ahead and tells, as much as he can, admitting to his part in actual murders of other boys, not 27, because he didn't even know Corll for quite a few of them, but Brooks did. So Brooks was actually much more implicated in these than Henley was. In fact, Brooks had brought Henley to meet Corll with the potential of being a victim. So that made this whole arrangement really unique, dicey. But at any rate, Corll then began using these 2 teenagers to bring boys to his various apartments and finally his house, and for parties. And then he'd pick the boys that he wanted to molest, torture, hold captive, and eventually murder and bury around Houston.
And that was what horrified people over those 3 days when that all came. And then he would actually tie them to a board he had created and keep them there for days for his pleasure, correct?
Yeah, sometimes two of them at once. And in
Yeah.
one case, we know that it was two friends. He told them to beat each other, and the one who survived would be let go. So, the mental torture, of course, no one would be let go, but the idea that the only way I'm getting out of this is to kill my friend, that's how Coral, yet nobody saw that side of Coral except these two accomplices, because he groomed the whole neighborhood. Everyone thought he was a great guy, a big brother, really nice. They found nothing to say that anyone would say about him that was negative.
But Tracy, when you were researching this, what was the process you had to go through, and what stumbling blocks did you hit along the way to try to get this story fleshed out so that the details were correct?
So one of the bigger issues here with the research is that you're basically going up against the established narrative that has been dictated by law enforcement. And so what we're doing is we are reading every police report over and over again with the goal of trying to discern, like the detail that you just gave of when people first heard about this. It's a man with his kind of teen lover. They're homosexuals. This was never the case. And so what we're having to say on the outset is what you thought you knew about this case isn't what this case was. Elmer Wayne Henley is not gay. Elmer Wayne Henley was, experienced a relationship with a predator who was, but who was also a pedophile. And I always like to distinguish between those two things. It's something where I think that was almost done on purpose, where you have the police giving these headlines out to media, but ultimately what's happening here is far more dark and far more systemic. This is no lover's tiff that Dean Corll was shot. This is somebody who had basically been groomed over years to do these destructive behaviors, who saw no other way out. What we discover from talking with Elmer Wayne Henley is that he tried to tell other adults in his life, I'm caught up in this crazy thing and I need your help. And time again, and we've heard this from other victims in human trafficking, it's unbelievable stuff. And especially in 1973, this was the largest mass murder in US history. And so you've got that happening. You've got this phenomenal amount of bodies, but what you don't hear in the media is that 11 of those victims are appearing in pornography. Police, when we research through their own files, document there's an individual, Dale Ahern, who comes in and says, this is where you're going to find these men. These are the publications which are listed. And we find this over and over again in 1975 and 1976 in California, other parts of Texas. You've got these pornographic images appearing again and again, potentially even appearing as the internet gets more visual. And you've got so much child pornography. These are some of the first images that people are going to see during that period. And so it's not just some guy in his apartment that is bringing, his apprentices, friends over to torture. This ends up looking like photographs that have been distributed, so they need a distribution network. This is, a professional publication, or whatever you'd like to call pornography. But these things are put together. It's not just one person handling these images. It's not just limited to Dean Corll. And then the other thing that we dug down into quite a bit was the fact that 4 days later in Dallas, you have an individual by the name of John David Norman, who is arrested because one of his potentially apprentices calls and says, I was just about to be shipped to Houston. I'm afraid that I'm going to die now. And they go to John David Norman's apartment in Dallas. It's raided with tons of child pornography, drugs. And simultaneously, you have both Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks talking about a syndicate as they're being interviewed by police. And this is kind of knocked by the wayside. When an individual says there's a syndicate, you would think they would want to interview or, kind of dig in and investigate further. But that's not what happens. What happens is John David Norman is arrested, but this man is a huge moneymaker. So although all of his belongings are confiscated, he's given bond almost immediately and goes straight for Chicago. He ends up getting in with a man by the name of Phil Paskey, and Phil Paskey works for John Wayne Gacy. They're all together in Chicago during the mid to late 1970s, and you start to see something much larger. And during the course of studying these things, trying to hit every angle in the 10 years previous to myself and Katherine working together, we could see nodules of the sex trafficking ring in North Fox Island, Michigan, in Franklin County, Kentucky. We saw it in New Orleans, Louisiana. And when I spoke with the investigators who looked at a Boy Scout troop that was being trafficked and abused there, they said the first place that they sent us to do further investigation was Europe. And so when you start to look at the width and breadth of this huge money-making, very popular ring, it's astounding. And I think, Katherine and I were interested in two different prongs of this. I was very interested in illuminating this huge sex trafficking ring that nobody seemed to know about. And the thing I really appreciated is that Katherine was very much into understanding the psychology. How did we get so many young people that were sucked into it?
Yeah, that's right on, and it's perfect. Now, 50 years later, unfortunately, we're all too well versed in sex trafficking. I mean, we now have a plethora of cases, and everybody is aware that this is a huge, huge, huge problem. I think most people aren't aware as how huge it is, but they do know it's out there. Back 50 years ago, this was shocking. And I remember this story was basically couched as the bad guy in this hotel was Elmer Wayne Henley. And at the end of the day, if there was a good guy in that trio, it was Elmer Wayne Henley. But it wasn't packaged that way. And so Katherine, how does a teenage kid from a regular family end up getting drug into this by a Dean Corll type who is a master manipulator? And then once there, feeling trapped, what mental gymnastics has to go through to decide I've got one way out, and that's to shoot this guy dead?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say he's from an ordinary family because it's lower socioeconomic, and so his dad, abusive alcoholic, who shot at him twice to kill him, leaves the family. He's 14. He has to start working to help with the bills. So that right away makes him vulnerable to somebody offering him money to do some things. He meets Brooks, who had basically targeted him to bring him to Corll, and he sees Brooks with a car and money, and he doesn't have a job. How does he get this stuff? And so Brooks kind of says, oh, well, we could let you in on this. And it's this slow process of opening doors and we'll bring you in, you'll be making a lot of money. And Corll tells him that, oh, this is a great gig, because if you bring me some boys who don't have such a great life here, we ship them off to California, where there'll be pool boys for wealthy couples in California. Everybody wins. You make some money, the kid gets a better life, they get a pool boy. What's terrible about this? But even at that, Wayne didn't go for it right away. It was really when he was feeling that he just needed some money, and this did not seem like that bad of a plan. So he then helped pick up a hitchhiker and brought him back to Corll's. He was sent home. He didn't know what Corll had in mind. But once this hitchhiker was killed, Corll now had leverage over Henley and said, you go to the police, you go down with me, and you will get executed. You'll get convicted, you'll get executed. And he's 15. What does he know? And who's going to believe him? And also, Coral has told him about this syndicate. Even if they do arrest Coral, the syndicate will come after him and maybe his family. So he's scared. He doesn't know what to do. He decides, all right, so I'm in this, and does not realize that he's going to be put to even worse tests before he even turns 16. He is required to kill, not just bring them, but kill them. And then the next step is kill two. And he keeps getting dug into this, and he doesn't see a way out because he didn't go the first time to the police. He still kicks himself to this day that he did not go to the police and just take whatever was coming, because he did not see what was going to happen with this. So you take a kid from a home with some adverse kinds of experiences, they will have vulnerabilities, whether it's they need money, they're looking for drugs, they're looking for excitement, they're leveraged into some other position, and happy to have a way out through this adult who isn't their parent. Coral was offering a place to party, he was offering rides, they could use his car, he was giving them money. So there were these things, but Wayne says he only was paid once. I know all the news stories were that he was bringing all his friends in and getting paid $200 a head. Well, mostly they weren't his friends. They were associates of Coral's that Coral wanted to, get rid of for some reason. And he wasn't being paid, he says. He was being promised payment, but not getting it. But mostly he just felt like, what else can I do except just do what he tells me to do? So he then kind of split into this double life where he could go home and be with his family and his friends and act like a regular kid. But at the same time, he's getting drunk every day. He's suffering, terrible substance abuse issues. Nobody's doing anything about it. They're noticing it and thinking this is a troubled kid, but nobody's really rescuing him. When he tries to tell 3 adults, they just brush him off. Like, he actually wrote out a confession and gave it to his mother. She ripped it up because she just there's no chance this is true. But she did, to her credit, make an appointment with a psychiatrist. It's just that he killed Coral before the appointment was happening. So in the end, he brought a couple of kids to Coral's house. They were going to go on a trip, and they got high, they passed out. Coral was mad that one of them was a girl, because he wanted the boy to himself, and the girl was an interference. So he bound them all. And when he woke them up, he said, now all of you are going to die, but I'm going to have my fun first. Wayne managed to talk his way out of the bondage by saying, look, I'll help you. I'll do whatever you want. Just let me go. And then when Coral did that and said he was going to keep control of the gun and the knife, but then didn't, laid the gun down, that was the opportunity. Now, Wayne was high. He barely could tell what was going on because he'd huffed acrylic paint fumes during the night. He'd had tequila or some other hard liquor, smoking dope. He was out of it, but he saw the gun. And I think what he thought was, I'm just going to threaten him with it and he'll back off and they'll be able to leave. That's as far as he could see. But instead, Coral came at him and said, you won't shoot, or he said, shoot me. We're not really clear. Shoot me, Wayne, you're not going to do it. And he had taught Wayne, if you start shooting, you shoot till your target goes down. So that's exactly what Wayne did. He followed Coral's instructions at Coral and shot until Coral went down.
So would you say after he drug Henley over dark threshold after darker threshold after darkest threshold and ingrained him deeper and deeper and deeper into this, that he miscalculated and this was a bridge too far, that his 2 friends, or was it just he was threatened, he was drug addled, he had a gun?
Which one are you?
Well, I mean, what do you think that Henley just decided that this is a bridge I'm not going to walk across. I'm not going to kill these two people for Dean because they were friends of mine? Or was he in
Yes.
such a situation, so drug addled and threatened himself that he just did it almost in self-defense? In other
No,
words, was
it was having the girl
yeah,
there. He had been, he lived in a home with his mother and his grandmother, and they had trained him about how you take care of women, respect for women. And there was Rhonda that he had brought there. And I think his protective instincts kicked in. He knew that he had to do something to protect her at the very least, even if he, if she had not been there, I don't know that it would have turned out in the same way that it did. Her presence was all the training that kicked in from his mother and grandmother, and he had to do something with her. I think that's what it was.
fascinating. Tracy, in your research, and obviously you said your slant was this whole ring. Is there a strong or any or tenuous connection between Coral and Norman and Gacy and things going up? How does that Silk Road, if you will, how does all that tie together? And is the evidence strong that this was indeed the case?
I think that it's circumstantial still, but we'll never get to the bottom of it. I think that it's in some ways important to make, certain assumptions at this point, because individuals that kill in this way and that are predators in this way tend to flock together. These are certain activities that need some kind of, double indemnification, where I've got images of a boy in a sexual position, you've got images of a boy in a sexual position. Well, now maybe we can congregate and see what kind of business we can do or what kind of things we can explore. I think that when you look at the torture boards, both individuals, John Wayne Gacy and Dean Coral, use them. The types of tortures tended to be similar. The fact that they both had accomplices is similar. And the connection where John David Norman seems to be out there in Dallas, and just 4 days later is arrested and immediately flees to Chicago, where John Wayne Gacy is already killing. When you talk about things like snuff films, this is in one of the interviews that was done by FBI agent Robert Ressler with John Wayne Gacy, where Gacy talks about John David Norman. Oh, I think I'd know him if I saw a photo of him. Oh yeah, I remember this employee of mine, Phil Paskey. He was a real weird one. He liked snuff films. And Gacy loved to kind of talk around issues. If you knew facts, that would be one thing. But with Robert Ressler, he kind of took him round the bend a little bit. But these things are still on record in his voice. So we know John David Norman and John Wayne Gacy had some affiliation. When John David Norman flees to Chicago, he basically sets up shop. Almost immediately is arrested and put into Cook County Jail. Now, coming from Dallas, he had something between 50 and 100,000 names on these note cards that were both what he called cadets and dons. Dons were the men that were going to be educating all these youngsters about travel and manners. And it was through an organization called the Odyssey Foundation. So, there was this air of legitimacy until you saw his regular newsletters. So he had between 50 and 100,000 names that were confiscated, ultimately given to the State Department. And in a senatorial record, you have the State Department saying, oh, they did find a couple of our members on these lists. Oh, unfortunately, these cards were destroyed because we didn't see any international travel infractions. So you see that in the senatorial report. But what you also see in one line is that police from Houston are in Chicago speaking with an individual. I can't remember what his full name was, but he was in charge of the youth division for Chicago Police Department. And in one line in the senatorial report, it says these police let them know that John David Norman had a connection to the deaths in Houston of the young men. And so when you look at that line and you isolate it, it's just shocking because nobody else would say these two were connected. And in fact, they do whatever they could to separate them as entities and keep this sex trafficking ring as ambiguous as possible. And so when I think about that, when I think about the research into John Wayne Gacy, where we find he submitted an inventory of his home to the Cook County court system. And within there, you have innumerable cameras. You've got a projector. You've got an editing system for 8mm film. You have purportedly blackmail files for celebrities, sports figures, and politicians. Now, none of these ever end up in the court record, along with Phil Paskey, who never is associated with John Wayne Gacy until we start digging. So it's all those circumstances that kind of, at the very least, mean that if there's smoke, there's going to be fire.
Well, this was all pre-computer, pre-internet, and all of that. How did these groups get to know each other and communicate with each other? Was it phone and mail, or do they have meetings? Do they have conventions? Yeah, I mean, what?
It was wild to look through all these different either court cases or pieces of evidence where you've got individuals that are obviously working through the United States postal system. So there is a case taken out against John David Norman, as well as an IRS investigation. Now, when I tried to FOIA those materials, I was refuted. I still may try to sue, but I'll have to sue those agencies in order to get any paperwork. When you think about people at North Fox Island, and it's funny, I was talking with Wayne Henley the other day because we figured out there are probably 3 oil scions that end up being a part of this ring. And one of them was from Humble Oil. And he worked with a man by the name of Guy Strait, who appears both in Texas files and in North Fox Island files in Michigan. What they had set up there was by another oil scion, I think through the Standard Oil Company. His name was Francis Sheldon. And Francis Sheldon, what they did was they got state and federal grants to have a summer camp for underprivileged children, to get them out of the city and into the countryside on this private island that
Wow.
Sheldon had. And so when you look at the records that show that they were a 501c3, I mean, that's just, and so you have sponsors that are associated with North Fox Island. You have sponsors in Boys Farm. That's what it was called in Franklin County. It was in Tennessee, actually, not Kentucky. But so what you have are ways in which these men can buy a share of, these camps, these, facilities where they're getting a steady stream of boys. When I read through the court files for Boys Farm, which was run by a pastor, Bud Vermeil, and in those court records, you just see how these young men testifying are mortified that they have to talk about their sexuality, are having to talk about the abuse that they've suffered, and the innumerable films and photographs that have been shot of them. They've lost track. And these things more than likely still exist. So, when you go around the country, you see individuals, teenagers either disappearing or they're gone and then suddenly show back up again. And there's no real explanation. Start to realize, these rings have a reach, sadly. And I think that the greatest thing for me about the book was at the very end where Katherine lists ways in which young people should be heard and validated if they have any concerns about being groomed.
Absolutely. And I agreed. I thought that was one of the more interesting parts of the book. Everyone should buy this book and read it because it is a lesson in the world. It's a lesson in psychopathology. Catherine, you earlier mentioned that apprentices almost never do away with their groomer. Yeah, I think a lot of the psychology behind that's pretty obvious, I would think. But what other insights can you offer as to why are they that much controlled? Are they that deeply ingrained in the process, or is it just are they just not have the wherewithal to break through and either escape or kill the guy?
A little of both. Some have turned them in. They haven't
Yeah,
killed them, but they've certainly, ended things. But for the most part, the predator is very careful about what they do. First, they look for a vulnerable person who is pliable enough. I talk about hard limits and soft limits, and they work through the soft limits to get past them and then start breaking down some of the other kinds of things that a person might not do. But for this predator, they will, because the predator has earned a way into their life to make himself the most important person to them. So important they'll keep the secret. So important they believe that this is the only source of love or appreciation or respect. And so he becomes a big part of their world. And no matter what they're doing outside of this relationship, this is a central feature in their life. And they're typically young, so we have the dynamics of the juvenile brain at play as well. And they're brought into something, they're given gifts, they're given privileges, they're made to feel special in a way that they're not being made to feel special in their other parts of their life. So it's a psychological dynamic of winning them over to the point where they really can't turn against the predator, even when they finally realize something's wrong. We have statements from some of these victims who've said, I know what he was doing was wrong, but I simply, even after I turned him in, I just thought I was being so disloyal and had betrayed him. And, so they're conflicted over what to do. And you hear Wayne Henley saying things like, if Dean was happy, I was happy, as if that explains anything. It doesn't, but it does to him, because he had arrived at the place where that was the most important thing. If it's okay with Dean and this is what he wants, then he's become the higher authority in my life, and I will just do what he wants because that will make me happy. And I don't really have to think that much about the consequences or the morality of this. He covers it because he's now created this world that we all share, the three of us, and nobody else is part of it. It's a privileged place, despite how horrible it is. And it's an odd psychological reformulating a person. So they're malleable and they can be reconnected in a different way to this predator who really, I mean, with David Brooks, for example, also from a broken home, parents who wanted nothing to do with him. At the age of 12, he's wandering around like, I don't know what to do. He was geeky, he was introverted, and people made fun of him because he was wearing these glasses. He had this straight blonde hair that was, just kind of a weird guy. Coral showed him respect. The first time he felt it from an adult. Then it was, here's some money, here's a gift, here's a room for you to stay in, here's a car. How could Coral not be the most important person in his life? And he's just not going to rock the boat, even though he sees what's going on. He's not rocking the boat because where else can he go?
exactly. I want to show this again because I want everybody to read this book. It's a cautionary tale. It's a fascinating tale. You will wiggle a little bit, you will squirm a little bit, but it's okay. Yeah, that's what it's all about. So I'll ask each of you as we get ready to close here, what do you hope this book accomplishes to a reader that's out there, other than understanding this story of one of the most prolific serial killers that no one's ever heard of? You know? What do you hope to accomplish, Catherine?
I want this story to be basically what Wayne Henley wants it to be, is a way for people to take kids seriously who might be in a position where they're trying to find out, they don't know how to talk about it. They're scared to talk about it. And, the adults have to pay attention to the markers of these kinds of things going on, because kids are more vulnerable today than they were 50 years ago with the social media and the internet and very sophisticated predators who know how to get around law enforcement systems. So I hope this is a wake-up call as well as a guidebook for parents, counselors, and teachers who all have to deal with kids who might be in this situation. This isn't about predators looking for prey. It's predators looking for partners and then looking for prey. And that's a middle step we haven't done much with, that we need to. We need intervention on that.
Excellent. Tracy?
I come at it from more of a personal point of view. I was widowed and left with 3 children, just as I was getting somebody coming to me saying, you should look at this old story about John Wayne Gacy and the possibility he has more victims. That was my late husband's boss at the Chicago Reader who said that. And although initially I wasn't interested, she said, let me put it another way, it's about corruption. And I didn't realize how much corruption was involved in the John Wayne Gacy case. So looking at myself as the mother of 3 children, suddenly I'm alone. I am traumatized. They are traumatized. We're trying to figure out how our lives are going to change. And at the same time, we're incredibly vulnerable. And what struck me as I was going along was my children are the kind of children John Wayne Gacy would have picked up off the street. I can't watch all 3 of them and work and run a household. And so that vulnerability kind of signaled to me, wait, there's something bigger afoot here. And then when we could literally start tying in law enforcement for having John Wayne Gacy committing 6, 7 violent sexual offenses before he's ultimately found, always being let go, always being able to tell his victims, no one will ever believe you. And thinking about the systemic aspect, it scared me to death. And so that motivated me to keep thinking, what am I looking at here? You have to have an imagination that these things go on. I have to just think that on the other side of it, most people are like me. I'm just trying to work, keep my house so that I don't lose it, to keep my children in Snickers, and stay focused on having some decent life before my short life is over. And you can't do that. You have to be paying attention to the subcultures that are working around us. We have to understand signs. Even with this research that I was doing, I have an autistic child, and we went to a park district in a suburb of Chicago. And at one point I allowed him to go into the men's room all by himself while I went to the ladies' room. Ultimately, I can hear him giggling. This is only 5 seconds after I've left. And the one man that was behind the counter at the park district had entered the bathroom and had accosted my child. And so he saw my child was vulnerable and he did not think twice. He was going to get in there. And this is how so many predators work. And they work quickly and they work ubiquitously. And so I think that in the book, Katherine describes, something called murder, where individuals can see the vulnerabilities. And even though most sex traffickers, their business is not killing, they can see victims very clearly. They understand what those needs are and they move in quickly. So I just wanted other parents to have the information that they would need to know you've got to go that extra mile. You've got to give the bigger effort to your children and watch them.
It's true. And they're out there and they're smart. Most predators are. I mean, if you look in the animal kingdom, predators survive because they're smart and because they can recognize the weak gazelle, and I think this world is not that much different. I don't know how they do it. I don't know what they see. I don't know what they sense. I guess I don't have a good murder. I don't know, but the point is that they do, And when you look back, you say, my God, I would have never predicted this. No one would have ever predicted Elmer Wayne Henley, Dean Corll, and David Brooks. No one would have ever predicted it. And yet, here we are. Well, well, I want to thank you both for being here. This has just been fascinating, and I wish you all the luck in the world with this book. And obviously, we will put this out there. We'll put your websites out there so people can go learn more about you and your books and your other stuff, not just this book, but everything else. So I want to thank you both very, very much for being here.
Well, thanks for
Thank-
having us. I appreciate it.
Well, that'll conclude this episode of Criminal Mischief, the art and science of crime fiction here on the Outliers YouTube channel. I'm DP Lyle. I'm going to be signing off, but we will be back with more programming and more interviews. So until then, have a good one.